Hey guys, tonight we journey into the depths of the Old Republic era, where we'll uncover the tragic tale of the most powerful yet conflicted Sith Lord who ever lived. The warrior whose love would become his greatest weakness, whose vision would challenge empires, and whose tears would mark the beginning of his ultimate downfall. So before you settle in for this epic journey, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into Star Wars lore. Here's something interesting. 86% of you watching right now aren't subscribed yet, so if this content resonates with you, that subscribe button would really help me continue bringing you these stories. I'd love to hear from you in the comments about where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the galaxy. There's something magical about knowing we're all sharing this story together across different time zones and continents. Now dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, get comfortable under your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight we venture into the shadows of the Old Republic, where the greatest Sith warrior who ever lived would face a choice that would define not just his destiny, but the fate of billions across the galaxy. The year is 3653, before the Battle of Yavin. Above the gleaming cityscape of Coruscant, Republic capital and jewel of the galaxy, Sith warships descend like harbingers of apocalypse. The Jedi Temple, sanctuary of light and wisdom for over 1,000 generations, trembles as dark side energy crackles through its sacred halls. At the heart of this chaos stands a figure clad in crimson and black, his lightsaber cutting through Jedi defenders like a scythe through wheat. This is Darth Malgus, and he has just accomplished what no Sith has managed in centuries. He has brought the Republic to its knees. But here is the mystery that will haunt us through this tale. In this moment of his greatest triumph, as Jedi Masters fall before his blade and the Republic Senate prepares to surrender, something extraordinary happens. A single tear rolls down the face of this unstoppable warrior. Not a tear of joy or victory, but something far more complex. Something that speaks to a truth buried so deep within his soul that even he does not yet understand it. You see, Darth Malgus was never meant to be just another Sith Lord drunk on power and destruction. His story is one of transformation, of a man who would dare to challenge not just the Republic, but the very foundations of the Sith Empire itself. A warrior who would discover that the greatest enemy he would ever face was not the Jedi, not the Republic, but the darkness within his own heart. This is the tale of how a slave boy named Veradun became the most feared Sith warrior in the galaxy. How he would fall in love with the one person who could save his soul, only to destroy her with his own hands. How he would conquer Coruscant and reshape the balance of power across 1,000 worlds, yet lose everything that truly mattered to him. But that single tear on Coruscant, that moment of inexplicable sorrow in his hour of victory, that mystery begins with understanding who Malgus truly was before the galaxy knew his name. To understand the man who would one day shake the very foundations of galactic civilization, we must first journey to a world where darkness reigns eternal, Drummond Casey. Even speaking its name feels like invoking something ancient and terrible. This planet exists in perpetual twilight, shrouded beneath storm clouds that have raged for millennia without pause. Lightning splits the sky in violent purple streaks, illuminating the twisted spires of the Sith Academy, where young acolytes learn that compassion is weakness and mercy is death. The air itself tastes of ozone and ambition, thick with the residual energy of countless Force lightning displays and lightsaber duels that have consecrated this ground in blood. Here, in the shadow of crumbling Sith monuments older than recorded history, a boy named Veradun takes his first steps toward infamy. Unlike the privileged offspring of Sith nobility who populate most of the Academy, Veradun possesses something far more dangerous than birthright. He has hunger, not the petty hunger for power that drives lesser students, but something deeper. a gnawing need to prove that strength of will can overcome any disadvantage, any obstacle, any enemy. His master Veradun recognizes this quality immediately. Where other instructors see merely another promising student, Veradun observes something that makes even his weathered Sith heart quicken with anticipation. The boy moves through lightsaber forms with an intensity that borders on religious devotion. When he channels the dark side, the Force doesn't simply bend to his will, it embraces him like a long-lost lover, finally returned home. The ancient training chambers echo with the clash of practice sabers as Veradun spars against multiple opponents simultaneously. His fellow acolytes circle him like predators, each seeking to prove their superiority by bringing down the one student their instructors consistently praise. What they discover instead is that Veradun fights not with the calculated cruelty typical of Sith training, but with something far more unsettling: pure, focused determination. Between these brutal lessons, Veradun spends his solitary hours in the Academy's vast archives, surrounded by holocrons that whisper secrets of ancient Dark Lords. Ajunta Pal, Marka Ragnos, Naga Sado, names that once commanded star systems and bent entire civilizations to their will. Yet as he studies their histories, a troubling pattern emerges. Each of these legendary figures ultimately fell not to external enemies, but to the very system they had mastered, betrayed by apprentices, undermined by rivals, consumed by the endless cycle of Sith infighting that has plagued the Empire since its inception. This realization plants a seed in Veradun's mind that will grow into something unprecedented. What if the Sith philosophy of individual supremacy actually weakens the Empire as a whole? What if their greatest strength could become their ultimate downfall? His dormitory overlooks the sprawling cityscape of Kars City, where Imperial citizens go about their lives under the watchful gaze of Sith overseers. From his window, Veradun can see the massive pyramidal structures that house the Dark Council, those 12 Sith Lords who theoretically rule the Empire, but spend most of their energy scheming against each other. Even from this distance he can sense the undercurrents of hatred and ambition that flow between those towers like toxic rivers. Late at night, when the storm winds howl across the Academy grounds and his fellow students retreat to their chambers, Veradun stands alone on the training platforms. Lightning illuminates his young face as he practices forms that no instructor has taught him, movements that flow from instinct rather than tradition. His master Veradun watches these nocturnal practices from the shadows, recognizing that his student is evolving into something the Academy has never produced before. Not just another Sith Lord obsessed with personal power, but a visionary who sees the Empire's potential with startling clarity. Yet even Veradun cannot foresee the path his student will ultimately choose. The name Darth Malgus still lies dormant, waiting for the moment when Veradun's transformation becomes complete and irreversible. The transformation from Veradun to something darker began on a morning when the storms above Dromund Cassus seemed particularly violent, as if the planet itself sensed the significance of what was about to unfold. Master Veradun summoned his most promising student to the deepest levels of the Academy, where ancient Sith rituals were conducted away from prying eyes and recording devices. These lower chambers existed in near-complete darkness, illuminated only by the crimson glow of emergency lighting that cast everything in shades of blood. The walls bore inscriptions in the old Sith language, words of power and domination carved by hands that had turned to dust millennia ago. Veradun could feel the weight of history pressing down upon him as he followed his master through corridors that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Today, my young apprentice, you will either embrace your destiny or be consumed by it, Veradun announced, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The Dark Council has approved your trials. If you succeed, you will earn a Sith name and rank. If you fail, your bones will join the foundation stones of this academy. The first trial thrust Veradun into combat against 3 senior acolytes simultaneously, each armed with vibroswords and burning with jealousy over his rapid advancement. These weren't practice weapons designed to merely sting and teach lessons. These blades could maim, could kill, and his opponents had been given explicit permission to use lethal force. The first attacker lunged forward with practiced precision, but Veradun had already moved beyond conventional lightsaber techniques. He channeled pure rage into his blade work, each strike carrying enough force-enhanced power to send shockwaves through his opponent's weapon. The vibro sword shattered under the assault, leaving its wielder defenseless and bleeding from force lightning that erupted from Veradun's fingertips without conscious thought. The second and third opponents attacked together, hoping to overwhelm him through coordinated strikes. Instead, they discovered that Veradun had transcended the limitations of reactive combat. He wasn't responding to their attacks so much as orchestrating a deadly dance where their every move served his ultimate victory. A spinning leap carried him above their guard while simultaneously bringing his saber down in an arc that left both attackers sprawled unconscious on the stone floor. Master Vindican observed this display with growing satisfaction. His student had finally accessed the wellspring of power that separated true Sith from mere force-sensitive pretenders. But the trials were far from over. The second challenge required Veradun to venture alone into the tomb of an ancient Sith Lord buried beneath the Academy foundations. These crypts were notorious for their lethal traps and guardian spirits that fed on the life force of intruders. Many promising acolytes had entered such places, only to emerge as hollow-eyed shells, their minds shattered by encounters with horrors beyond mortal comprehension. Descending into the tomb felt like traveling backward through time itself. Each step took him deeper into an era when the Sith Empire spanned half the known galaxy and Dark Lords commanded fleets that could reduce entire star systems to cosmic dust. The air grew thick with residual dark side energy, making every breath an effort and causing his skin to tingle with barely contained power. At the burial chamber's heart, he discovered something that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The mummified remains of Darth Tenebrous, a Sith Lord from the time of the Great Hyperspace War, sat upon a throne carved from a single massive crystal. But it was not the corpse that commanded Veradun's attention. It was the holocron clutched in skeletal fingers, still pulsing with malevolent intelligence after all these centuries. When he reached for the device, Tenebrous's spirit manifested in a swirl of dark energy and ancient hatred. The ghost's voice seemed to emerge from everywhere and nowhere, filling the chamber with words that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his soul. "You seek power, young one, but do you understand its true cost? I commanded legions, conquered worlds, bent entire civilizations to my will. Yet here I remain, trapped in this tomb, while my empire crumbles to dust above me. Tell me, what makes you believe your fate will be any different?" Veradun stood his ground as the spectral figure circled him like a predator evaluating prey. "Because I will not make your mistakes. I will not allow the Empire to consume itself through endless infighting. I will forge something stronger, something worthy of the power we wield." The ghost's laughter sent shivers through the Force itself. Ambitious words from one so young. "Very well, I grant you my knowledge. But know this, the dark side gives freely of its strength, but it demands payment in equal measure. Every victory will cost you something precious. Every moment of power will be balanced by loss. Remember this when your greatest triumph becomes your deepest regret." With those prophetic words, the holocron transferred its contents directly into Veradun's mind. Centuries of Sith wisdom, battle tactics, and force techniques flooded his consciousness in a torrent of barely comprehensible information. He stumbled from the tomb forever changed, carrying knowledge that would reshape his understanding of what it truly meant to be Sith. "Choose your weapon," Vindican commanded. But understand that the moment you ignite that blade, Veradun ceases to exist. You will be reborn as something new, something powerful, something the galaxy will learn to fear. His hand moved instinctively toward a lightsaber that seemed to call to him across the space between them. The weapon felt perfect in his grip, as if it had been crafted specifically for his hands. When he activated the crimson blade, power coursed through him, unlike anything he had experienced during his years of training. This wasn't just a weapon, it was an extension of his will made manifest. "Kneel," his master instructed, and Veradun found himself compelled to obey, not through fear, but through recognition that this moment represented a threshold he could never uncross. Vindican placed both hands on his student's shoulders and spoke words in the ancient Sith tongue, a ritual of naming that had been performed countless times over thousands of years. "By the power of the dark side, by the strength of your will, by the promise of conquest yet to come, I name you Darth Malgus. Rise, my former apprentice. Rise as a Lord of the Sith." The young man who stood up from that ceremonial floor was no longer the hungry student who had descended into the Academy's depths that morning. Darth Malgus looked upon the world with eyes that held depths of power and purpose that would have been incomprehensible to his former self. The transformation was complete, but it was also just the beginning. As he left his master's chambers, newly christened with a name that would echo through galactic history, Malgus felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders like a comfortable cloak. The Republic had no idea what was coming for them. The Jedi could not imagine the storm that was even now gathering strength in the depths of Sith space. But perhaps most significantly, Malgus himself could not yet foresee the price he would ultimately pay for the power he had just claimed. The ghost's warning echoed in his memory, but like so many young beings drunk on newfound strength, he believed himself destined for a different fate than those who had walked this path before him. Time would prove how wrong he was. The newly christened Darth Malgus found himself assigned to quarters befitting his elevated status, chambers that had once belonged to Sith Lords whose names were now carved on memorial walls throughout Cass City. These rooms contained treasures that most acolytes could only dream of accessing. Ancient texts bound in the hide of creatures from extinct worlds, holocrons that whispered secrets in languages that predated the formation of the Republic, and most precious of all, a private study lined with historical records from the Great Hyperspace War. It was here, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of millennia, that Malgus began to understand the true scope of Sith failure. The empire that had once stretched across 1,000 star systems now controlled barely a dozen worlds, hidden away in the farthest reaches of known space like criminals, afraid of discovery. This wasn't the natural result of military defeat. This was the consequence of a fundamental flaw in Sith philosophy itself. Night after night, as Drummond Cassie's eternal storms raged outside his windows, Malgus pored over tactical analyses from the ancient campaigns. Naga Sado's forces had possessed superior technology, better training, and the element of surprise when they launched their assault on the Republic. They should have conquered Coruscant within months, establishing a galactic empire that would have lasted for millennia. Instead, the Sith had turned on each other at the moment of their greatest advantage. Ludo Kresh had undermined Sado's strategies out of personal jealousy. The Dark Lords had spent more energy scheming against their own allies than fighting their actual enemies. Victory had been transformed into devastating defeat, not by Republic strength, but by Sith weakness. The pattern was so obvious that Malgus wondered how generations of Sith historians had failed to recognize it. He began drafting his own analyses, treatises that would have been considered heretical by the Academy's more traditional instructors. What if the Sith rule of two, established by Darth Bane centuries after the Hyperspace War, had been a response to exactly this problem? What if individual Sith power was meaningless without the structure to support and direct it toward meaningful conquest? These philosophical investigations were interrupted by his first assignment as a full Sith Lord. The Dark Council had identified Republic survey teams operating dangerously close to Imperial space, mapping hyperspace routes that could potentially expose the Empire's hidden refuge. Malgus was ordered to eliminate these scouts and capture their navigational data. The mission took him to the Tingle Arm, where Republic exploration vessels probed the boundaries between known space and the Great Unknown. These weren't military targets. They were scientists and cartographers, civilians whose only crime was professional curiosity about what lay beyond the mapped regions of the galaxy. Malgus's first target was a converted transport vessel called the Meridian Dawn, crewed by a mixed-species team of researchers who had been months away from home mapping previously unknown star systems. They had no reason to expect attack. No warning that they were operating in territory claimed by an empire they didn't even know existed. When Malgus boarded their ship, he expected to find the terror and desperation that usually accompanied Sith attacks. Instead, he discovered something that gave him pause. The research team's leader, an elderly Duros scientist named Kep Senru, faced him with quiet dignity rather than cowering fear. "You're Sith," Senru observed, studying Malgus's crimson lightsaber and distinctive armor. "I've read about your kind in historical texts, but I thought the Sith Empire had been extinct for centuries." The casual academic interest in his voice was so unexpected that Malgus found himself responding rather than simply executing the man. "We are very much alive, and we have been watching your Republic's expansion with great interest." "Fascinating," the Duros replied, seemingly oblivious to the mortal danger he faced. "I've spent my career studying the remnants of ancient Sith architecture on Coruscant. The artistry, the technological sophistication, the sheer scope of ambition reflected in those ruins. What happened to that civilization? How did builders of such magnificence end up hiding in the galactic rim?" "You would not understand," he finally replied. But even as he spoke the words, he recognized their emptiness. "Perhaps not," Senru agreed. "But I understand enough about history to recognize that great civilizations fall from within far more often than they're conquered from without. The old republics collapsed during the Jedi Civil War, the Mandalorian Crusades that ended when their leaders turned on each other, even the Rakata, infinite empire that once ruled half the galaxy. Internal division destroys empires that external enemies could never touch." Malgus executed the research team as his orders required, but their leader's words continued to resonate long after he'd completed his mission. Here was validation from an unexpected source that his analysis of Sith weakness was accurate. The Empire's current hidden status wasn't strategic patience, it was the predictable result of fundamental flaws in their approach to power. His second assignment took him deeper into Republic space, where he encountered something even more troubling than academic insight. Malgus defeated them, as his superior training and force abilities made victory inevitable. But he couldn't escape the realization that these Republic officers, working together despite their diverse species and backgrounds, had presented a more cohesive threat than most Sith battle groups he'd observed. Returning to Drummond Cass with captured Republic intelligence, he requested an audience with the Dark Council to present his findings. The council chambers were a study in barely controlled hostility, 12 of the most powerful Sith in the galaxy maintaining a facade of cooperation, while each schemed for advantage over the others. Darth Malgus, the council's military strategist, reviewed Malgus's tactical reports with professional interest. "Your analysis of Republic fleet movements is thorough, Lord Malgus. Their expansion into the Outer Rim proceeds faster than our previous intelligence suggested. The expansion itself is less concerning than the methodology behind it," Malgus replied. "They achieve strategic objectives through coordinated effort rather than individual brilliance. Their strength comes from unity of purpose." As he left the council chambers, Malgus realized that he had just experienced a perfect demonstration of the very problem he'd been analyzing. Presented with strategic intelligence that challenged their preconceptions, the Dark Council had chosen to attack the messenger rather than consider the message. That night, alone in his quarters with ancient holocrons providing the only illumination, Malgus made a decision that would ultimately reshape the galaxy. If the current Sith leadership was incapable of learning from past mistakes, then perhaps it was time for new leadership. Someone who understood that true strength came not from individual dominance, but from the ability to forge diverse elements into an unstoppable force. He had no way of knowing that the greatest cost would be measured not in political power or military conquest, but in the life of the one person who would teach him what it truly meant to love. Word of Malgus's unconventional strategic thinking reached elements within the Empire who had grown weary of the Dark Council's endless internal squabbling. 3 months after his confrontation with the Council, he received orders that would change the trajectory of his career forever. The Empire's intelligence division had identified a Republic military installation on Sullust that was coordinating supply lines for several key sectors. Rather than assigning this crucial mission to a proven admiral with decades of experience, they had chosen to test whether his theories about unified command could translate into practical victories. The assignment came with resources that reflected both opportunity and risk. Malgus was given command of a small but elite task force consisting of 2 Harrower-class dreadnoughts, a squadron of Sith fighters, and most significantly, a diverse crew that included alien species traditionally relegated to support roles within Imperial military structure. His flagship, the Might of the Empire, became a laboratory for testing ideas that would have been considered heretical at the Sith Academy. Instead of the usual Imperial hierarchy, based purely on species and force sensitivity, Malgus implemented a meritocracy, where tactical skill and proven competence determined rank regardless of biological origin. The ship's navigation officer was a Chiss whose spatial reasoning abilities surpassed any human equivalent. His chief engineer was a Ratataki whose innovative modifications increased engine efficiency by 15%. Most controversially, his senior tactical advisor was a Twill whose strategic insights had been dismissed by previous Imperial commanders simply because of her species. This diverse command structure produced immediate results. The task force's approach to the Sullust installation demonstrated coordination and adaptability that caught Republic defenders completely off guard. The battle itself unfolded like a master class in tactical innovation. Republic sensors detected what appeared to be a standard Imperial assault formation approaching their primary defensive perimeter. Automated systems responded predictably, concentrating firepower on the apparent threat while secondary defensive positions maintained standard alert status. While Republic forces engaged his decoy ships, Malgus personally led a strike team through an asteroid field that previous Imperial commanders had deemed too dangerous for navigation. His Chiss navigator's superior spatial awareness combined with Malgus's force-enhanced reflexes allowed them to thread between asteroids that would have destroyed conventional vessels. The supply depot's defenders had perhaps 30 seconds to realize their mistake before Malgus's lightsaber cut through their command center's blast doors. The facility's commanding officer, a veteran Republic colonel named Marcus Trant, managed to trigger a general distress signal before Sith forces overwhelmed his position. But what happened next defied every expectation Colonel Trant had developed about Sith methodology during his long military career. Instead of the massacre he anticipated, Malgus offered terms of surrender that were almost unprecedented in Imperial military history. "Your resistance was admirable, Colonel," Malgus announced. Deactivating his lightsaber as captured Republic personnel were assembled in the depot's central hangar. "You demonstrated tactical competence and personal courage under impossible circumstances. Such qualities deserve recognition rather than punishment." Trant studied this unusual Sith Lord with professional curiosity rather than the terror that usually accompanied Imperial capture. "You're offering to let us live?" I'm offering you the opportunity to serve an empire that recognizes talent regardless of its origin, Malgus replied. Your strategic database contains information about Republic fleet movements and supply networks. Provide that intelligence willingly and your personnel will be treated as prisoners of war rather than executed as examples. The moral complexity of this offer was not lost on Colonel Trant. Military intelligence doctrine required him to resist interrogation, but the lives of his subordinates hung in the balance. What guarantee do I have that you'll keep your word? Trant asked. The same guarantee you would offer if our positions were reversed, Malgus answered. The word of a professional soldier to another professional soldier. This reputation for unexpected mercy created tactical advantages that purely aggressive commanders could never achieve. Republic forces facing other Imperial units fought with the desperation of beings who expected no quarter. Troops confronting Malgus's forces sometimes chose surrender over suicidal resistance, recognizing that capture didn't necessarily mean death. However, this unconventional approach to warfare generated increasing tension with traditional Imperial doctrine. Darth Malgus, a member of the Dark Council responsible for military oversight, summoned Malgus to explain why his casualty reports consistently showed lower enemy fatalities than other commanders achieved. The purpose of Imperial military action is to demonstrate Sith superiority through overwhelming force. Angrel lectured during their private meeting in his fortress on Drummond Caius. Mercy is weakness, and weakness undermines the fear that maintains our enemy's compliance. Malgus chose his response carefully, recognizing that political missteps could end his career regardless of military success. My lord, I submit that dead enemies provide no strategic value. Living enemies who recognize Imperial strength and choose cooperation over continued resistance serve the Empire's long-term interests more effectively than martyrs who inspire others to rebellion. You speak like a politician rather than a Sith, Angrel observed, his tone carrying unmistakable warning. Perhaps your time among alien subordinates has contaminated your understanding of proper Imperial values. I speak as a Sith who recognizes that our Empire's greatest defeats have come from underestimating our enemies, Malgus replied. The Republic endures not because they are stronger than us, but because they successfully integrate the strengths of multiple species while we dismiss potential allies based on biological prejudice. The silence that followed this statement stretched for several heartbeats before Angrel responded with cold fury. You walk a dangerous line, Lord Malgus. The Dark Council's patience with your experimental methods is not infinite. Their meeting ended with formal politeness that barely concealed mutual hostility. As Malgus departed Angrel's fortress, he understood that his relationship with the Dark Council had fundamentally changed. He was no longer simply an ambitious young Sith Lord seeking advancement within the existing system. He had become something far more dangerous from their perspective, a voice advocating for systematic change. Returning to his ship, Malgus found his senior staff preparing for their next assignment, a complex operation targeting Republic shipping lanes in the Corellian system. His tactical advisors had developed a campaign plan that would disrupt enemy supply networks while minimally exposing Imperial forces to counterattack. But as he reviewed their proposals, Malgus found himself thinking beyond immediate tactical concerns. Each successful mission brought him closer to a reckoning with the Empire's leadership. The Dark Council would eventually move against him if he continued challenging their authority, regardless of his military achievements. The question was not whether that confrontation would come, but whether he would be ready when it arrived. Victory would require more than tactical brilliance or force powers. It would demand the kind of unified support structure that the current Sith system made nearly impossible to achieve. The seeds of rebellion were taking root in his mind, though he did not yet recognize them as such. He thought he was simply becoming a better servant of Imperial interests. time would reveal that the most dangerous revolutionaries are often those who begin with the sincere belief that they are defending the institutions they ultimately transform beyond recognition. The Corellian campaign unfolded exactly as Malgus's tactical projections had predicted. Republic supply convoys found themselves trapped in hyperspace interdiction fields while Sith fighters systematically dismantled their escort vessels. Within 6 standard days, 3 major shipping routes had been effectively severed, forcing the Republic Navy to redeploy significant resources from other sectors to protect their remaining logistical networks. But victory in the Corellian system brought an unexpected complication. Among the captured vessels was a luxury transport carrying what Imperial intelligence initially classified as high-value prisoners. The ship's manifest listed several prominent Republic citizens traveling under diplomatic immunity, making their detention a potentially sensitive political matter. Malgus boarded the transport personally, expecting to find the usual collection of corrupt politicians and war profiteers who often traveled under diplomatic cover during wartime. Instead, he discovered something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life in ways that no amount of strategic planning could have anticipated. The transport's passenger compartment had been converted into makeshift medical facilities where Republic civilians tended to wounded refugees from previous Imperial raids. The scene that greeted Malgus defied every assumption he had developed about Republic decadence and moral weakness. Here were beings of multiple species working together without regard for personal safety, using their own medical supplies to treat injuries sustained by complete strangers. At the center of this humanitarian effort moved a Twi'lek woman whose grace and composure remained unshaken despite the chaos surrounding her. She knelt beside a wounded human child, speaking in soft tones that somehow conveyed comfort across the barrier of different languages. Her leku moved with subtle expressions that indicated deep emotional engagement with each person she treated, yet her hands remained steady as she applied Bacta patches with professional competence. When she noticed Malgus's presence, she looked up without the fear or hatred he typically encountered from Republic civilians. Her eyes held something far more disconcerting than anger. They held curiosity, as if she was studying a fascinating but potentially dangerous creature rather than cowering before an enemy commander. "You're the Sith Lord they call Malgus," she observed, returning her attention to the injured child while continuing to speak in that same calm tone. "Your reputation suggests someone who kills without discrimination, yet these people are still alive." The directness of her statement caught him off guard. Most beings in her position would either beg for mercy or hurl defiant curses at their captors. She seemed to be conducting an academic analysis of his behavior patterns. "I am Darth Malgus," he confirmed, studying her with equal fascination. "Alina Daru," she replied, finishing her treatment of the child before turning to face him fully. "I was traveling to Coruscant to deliver medical supplies when your forces intercepted our convoy." There was something in the way she spoke his title, without mockery, but also without the reverence that most Imperial citizens displayed. She treated Darth Malgus as simply a name rather than a statement of absolute authority over life and death. "You show no fear," he noted, genuinely puzzled by her composure. Her pragmatic acceptance of circumstances beyond her control impressed him more than desperate pleas or heroic defiance might have. Here was someone who understood that emotional displays rarely influenced outcomes in meaningful ways, a perspective that aligned surprisingly well with Sith philosophy, despite her obvious commitment to helping others. As Imperial troops processed the other prisoners, Malgus found himself returning repeatedly to observe Alina's work. She moved through the transport's compartments with quiet efficiency, prioritizing medical needs based on severity rather than species or social status. A wounded Rodian smuggler received the same careful attention as a Republic senator's aide. Her approach to triage decisions revealed strategic thinking that would have impressed his military advisors. She allocated limited medical resources to achieve maximum benefit for the largest number of patients, making difficult choices about who could be saved and who was beyond help. Yet these calculations never seemed to diminish her compassion for individual suffering. Elena paused in her work to consider his question seriously. Because the act of trying has value beyond the outcome. These people deserve to know that someone cared enough to make the effort, even if that effort ultimately fails. That is sentimentality, not logic, he replied, though his tone lacked the dismissive edge that usually accompanied such observations. Her analysis of imperial methodology was uncomfortably accurate. Malgus had reached similar conclusions through military experience, but hearing them articulated by someone outside the power structure gave them additional weight. Over the following days, as his task force prepared to depart the Corellian system, Malgus found excuses to visit the prisoner holding areas where Elena continued her medical work under imperial supervision. These conversations gradually revealed a perspective on galactic politics that challenged many of his fundamental assumptions. She had traveled extensively throughout Republic space, providing humanitarian aid in regions devastated by various conflicts. Her experiences had given her insights into how different species and cultures responded to both imperial and Republic governance. Unlike the propagandists on both sides, she spoke from direct observation rather than ideological commitment. The Republic's greatest strength isn't their military or their technology, she explained, during one particularly lengthy discussion. It's their ability to make diverse populations feel genuinely included in something larger than themselves. Species that have been enemies for centuries find common ground through shared participation in democratic institutions. Democracy is inefficient, Malgus countered. Decisive action requires unified command, not endless debate among competing interests. Decisive action certainly has its place, Elena agreed. But sustainable progress requires buy-in from the people affected by those decisions. Your empire can conquer territory through superior force, but holding that territory requires the consent of the conquered. Fear alone isn't sufficient for long-term stability. These philosophical exchanges continued even after his task force returned to Imperial space. Rather than processing Elena through standard prisoner channels, Malgus had arranged for her transfer to his personal staff as a medical advisor. The decision raised eyebrows among his subordinates, but his reputation for unconventional methods provided sufficient cover for what was essentially a personal fascination disguised as tactical innovation. Her presence aboard his flagship created subtle changes in shipboard culture that surprised everyone, including Malgus himself. The diverse crew members who had previously maintained careful professional distance began engaging in casual conversations during off-duty hours. Species barriers that had never been explicitly addressed but had always existed started breaking down through shared experiences and mutual respect. Elena seemed to catalyze these changes without conscious effort. She treated each crew member as an individual rather than a representative of their species or rank, asking about their backgrounds, their families, their personal interests beyond military service. Her genuine curiosity about their lives as complete beings rather than functional units created an atmosphere of inclusion that had been absent from previous Imperial vessels Malgus had served aboard. More troubling from a strategic perspective was the effect her presence had on his own decision-making processes. Malgus found himself considering not just the tactical implications of his orders, but their human cost. When planning raids against Republic installations, he caught himself wondering how many civilians like Elena might be affected by his actions. This internal conflict reached a crisis point during a briefing about their next major assignment. Imperial intelligence had identified a Republic medical research facility that was allegedly developing biological weapons for use against Imperial forces. The evidence was circumstantial but credible enough to justify a preemptive strike. Recommended approach is orbital bombardment, his tactical officer reported. Complete destruction of the facility and surrounding infrastructure will eliminate any potential threat while serving as a deterrent to similar research efforts. Malgus studied the intelligence reports, noting that the research station was located adjacent to a civilian medical complex treating refugees from previous battles. Standard Imperial doctrine would classify those civilians as acceptable casualties in service of the larger strategic objective. But as he considered authorizing the bombardment, he found himself imagining Alina's reaction to such unnecessary loss of life. Not her disapproval, which he could easily dismiss, but her analysis of how such actions served Imperial long-term interests. How many potential allies would be transformed into implacable enemies by the casual destruction of a medical facility? Revise the mission parameters, he ordered. We'll conduct a surgical strike against the research laboratories only. Minimize collateral damage to surrounding medical facilities. The order represented a significant departure from standard Imperial methodology, one that his staff accepted without question but would undoubtedly generate reports to higher authorities. Malgus was beginning to realize that his relationship with Alina was forcing him to confront contradictions in his own nature that he had never previously acknowledged. The summons arrived 6 months after Alina had become an integral part of Malgus's command structure, delivered by Imperial courier, whose obvious nervousness suggested the magnitude of whatever orders he carried. The message bore the personal seal of the Dark Council, indicating a mission of unprecedented importance and political sensitivity. Malgus opened the encrypted communication in his private quarters, with only Alina present to witness his reaction. The holographic projection of Darth Malgus materialized with typical Sith dramatic flair, his ancient features twisted into what might have been either anticipation or malicious amusement. Lord Malgus, your unconventional methods have achieved results that even your critics cannot dismiss. The Dark Council has therefore chosen you to lead the Empire's most ambitious military operation since the Great Hyperspace War. You will command the assault force tasked with capturing Coruscant itself. The projection continued with tactical briefings and logistical details, but Malgus found his attention divided between the enormity of the assignment and Alina's reaction to the news. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but he could sense the complex emotions this revelation generated. The woman he had come to love was being asked to participate in an attack against the very heart of the civilization she believed represented hope for galactic peace. After the hologram ended its transmission, they sat in silence for several minutes before Alina spoke. They're asking you to destroy everything I've spent my life trying to protect. They're asking me to win a war that has consumed both our civilizations for generations, Malgus replied, though even as he spoke the words, he recognized their inadequacy. Is that what you believe this is? A path to peace through conquest? Her tone carried disappointment rather than anger, which somehow made her question more challenging to answer. Malgus stood and moved to the viewport that dominated one wall of his quarters, gazing out at the stars that represented thousands of worlds caught between two competing visions of galactic order. I believe that the current situation is unsustainable. The Republic and Empire have been locked in cycles of conflict for centuries, with each temporary peace serving only as preparation for the next war. Perhaps decisive victory by one side is the only way to break that pattern. And if you succeed, if Coruscant falls and the Republic surrenders, what kind of galaxy do you expect to rule? One populated by beings who submit to Imperial authority out of fear rather than conviction. How long do you think such a system could maintain stability? Her questions touched on concerns that had been growing in his mind as he studied the tactical briefings. The operation being proposed was indeed audacious, possibly even brilliant from a purely military perspective. But the long-term consequences of success remained unclear even to the Dark Council members who had authorized it. The assault plan called for a coordinated strike involving the largest Sith battle fleet assembled since the ancient wars. 3 separate task forces would approach Coruscant from different vectors, overwhelming Republic defenses through sheer scale and surprise. Malgus's force would serve as the primary assault element, tasked with breaching the planet's defensive perimeter and securing key strategic targets. But beyond the immediate military objectives lay questions that troubled him more than any tactical challenge. What would happen to the billions of Republic citizens living on Coruscant after it fell to Imperial control? How would the Sith Empire maintain order across a galaxy that had never known Imperial rule? The Dark Council's briefings focused entirely on achieving victory without addressing the complexities of what came after. As weeks passed and the assault fleet gathered at various staging points throughout Imperial space, Malgus found himself conducting 2 parallel planning processes. The official preparation involved coordinating with other Imperial commanders, reviewing intelligence reports about Republic defenses, and training his forces for what would be the most challenging urban warfare operation in galactic history. The unofficial preparation was far more personal and infinitely more complex. He was trying to reconcile his role as an Imperial commander with his growing understanding of what that role would cost in terms of human suffering. Alina's presence forced him to confront the reality that every tactical decision would affect real people with hopes, fears, and dreams no different from his own. Their private conversations during this period revealed the depth of the philosophical chasm that separated not just their personal worldviews, but the civilizations they represented. Yet somehow, these differences served to strengthen rather than undermine their relationship. Each challenge to his assumptions forced Malgus to examine his beliefs more deeply, while Alina's exposure to Imperial methodology gave her insights into the genuine grievances that drove Sith aggression. "Your empire isn't evil in the way Republic propaganda suggests," she observed during one particularly lengthy discussion. "The Sith genuinely believe they're creating a more efficient and stable form of government. But efficiency and stability aren't the only values that matter in civilized society. The Republic's commitment to individual freedom has produced a government that cannot make difficult decisions quickly enough to address genuine threats," Malgus countered. "Democratic processes work well during peaceful times, but they become dangerous luxuries during crises that require immediate action. Perhaps the real solution isn't choosing between efficiency and freedom, but finding ways to combine the best elements of both systems," Alina suggested. "What if there were a form of government that could act decisively when necessary, while still respecting individual rights and species diversity?" The idea intrigued him more than he initially admitted. His own experience commanding diverse forces had demonstrated that species integration could enhance rather than undermine military effectiveness. If that principle could be applied to civilian governance, it might address many of the systemic weaknesses he had identified in both Imperial and Republic society. But such theoretical discussions felt increasingly irrelevant as the assault date approached. Orders arrived daily, refining tactical assignments, updating intelligence assessments, and coordinating the massive logistical effort required to transport and supply the largest military force in Imperial history. Malgus's flagship, now designated as the command vessel for the primary assault force, became a hub of activity as staff officers from throughout the Empire converged to finalize operational details. The ship's hangar bays filled with specialized assault craft designed for urban combat operations. Armories were stocked with weapons specifically chosen for fighting in dense civilian environments, where collateral damage had to be minimized to preserve valuable infrastructure. The most challenging aspect of the preparation was not military but psychological. Malgus had to maintain the focused aggression required for successful command, while simultaneously grappling with doubts about the long-term consequences of victory. His public persona remained that of an Imperial commander, absolutely committed to achieving the Dark Council's objectives. Privately, he wrestled with questions that had no clear answers. Alina served as both confidant and moral compass during this internal struggle. She never directly attempted to dissuade him from his duty, understanding that such efforts would be both futile and counterproductive. "When Coruscant falls, what happens to the Jedi Temple?" she asked one evening, as they reviewed tactical maps together. "It will be secured and searched for intelligence value," he replied automatically, then realized the deeper significance of her question. "You're concerned about the destruction of historical artifacts." "I'm concerned about the message such destruction would send to every culture in the galaxy that values its heritage over political expediency. The Jedi Temple represents thousands of years of accumulated wisdom and artistic achievement. Its destruction would convince billions of beings that imperial rule means the obliteration of everything they consider sacred." Her observation forced him to reconsider assumptions he had never previously questioned. The temple was indeed a legitimate military target, serving as both the command center for Jedi operations and a symbol of Republic resistance to imperial expansion. But it was also an irreplaceable repository of knowledge and culture that belonged to galactic civilization as a whole, rather than any single political entity. That night, he added a classified addendum to his operational orders specifying that the Jedi Temple should be captured intact rather than destroyed. His tactical staff accepted the modification without question, assuming it reflected intelligence requirements they were not cleared to understand. As the assault fleet completed its final preparations and began moving toward Republic space, Malgus found himself standing on his flagship's bridge, contemplating the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Success would make him the most celebrated military commander in Imperial history. Failure would likely result in court-martial and execution as a scapegoat for the Dark Council's ambitious gamble. Neither of them could foresee that the assault on Coruscant would force Malgus to choose between the woman he loved and the power he needed to achieve his vision of Imperial reform. That choice still lay ahead, hidden beyond hyperspace jumps and battles yet to be fought. The moment of truth arrived on a morning when Coruscant's artificial dawn was painting the planet's endless cityscape in shades of gold and crimson. Republic sensor networks detected the first Imperial ships emerging from hyperspace exactly where intelligence projections had predicted they would never appear. The Sith fleet had somehow bypassed every early warning system, appearing in the heart of the core worlds like a nightmare made manifest. Malgus stood on his flagship's command bridge, watching as the jewel of the Republic grew larger in the viewports ahead. From this distance, Coruscant appeared deceptively peaceful, its surface lights twinkling like stars against the darkness of space. No external signs revealed the panic that was undoubtedly spreading through government centers as military commanders realized the impossible was actually happening. "Fleet reports ready for assault operations," his tactical officer announced, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who understood they were about to participate in history. The assault plan unfolded with mechanical precision during its opening phases. Sith fighters launched from carrier vessels in carefully coordinated waves, each squadron tasked with neutralizing specific elements of Coruscant's defensive grid. Republic forces responded exactly as Imperial planners had anticipated, redeploying assets to counter apparent threats while leaving critical vulnerabilities exposed. But as the first exchanges of fire lit up the space around Coruscant, Malgus experienced something unexpected. Rather than the familiar surge of aggressive excitement that typically accompanied combat operations, he felt a strange hollow sensation in his chest. The tactical displays showed Imperial forces achieving their objectives with textbook efficiency, yet each successful strike against Republic positions generated more sorrow than satisfaction. Standing beside him on the bridge, Alina watched the battle unfold with an expression that mixed professional interest with profound sadness. She had spent years traveling throughout Republic space, visiting many of the installations that were now disappearing in brilliant flashes of destruction. Her silence spoke more eloquently than any protest could have about the human cost of what they were witnessing. "Primary defensive perimeter has been breached," reported the communications officer. "All assault groups are proceeding according to schedule." The words marked a turning point that Malgus had dreamed of since his earliest days as a Sith acolyte. Imperial forces were finally achieving the decisive victory that would reshape the balance of galactic power. Yet instead of triumph, he felt increasingly detached from the events unfolding around him, as if he were observing someone else's war rather than commanding his own forces. Republic resistance stiffened as Imperial ships approached the planet's surface, but their defensive efforts revealed the fundamental weaknesses that Sith strategists had identified years earlier. Individual Republic commanders fought with skill and courage, but their overall response lacked the coordination necessary to counter a truly unified assault. Democratic command structures that served them well during peacetime became fatal liabilities when faced with enemies who could adapt and respond faster than committee decisions allowed. Malgus's personal assault craft launched from the flagship's hangar bay as soon as orbital defenses had been sufficiently suppressed. His target was the Jedi Temple, the symbolic and practical heart of Republic resistance. The descent through Coruscant's atmosphere felt surreal, like traveling through a three-dimensional representation of everything the Republic claimed to represent. Massive towers stretched toward the sky, each one housing millions of beings from hundreds of different species. But as his assault craft approached the Temple District, signs of the battle's impact became increasingly visible. Fires burned in several government buildings where Sith commando teams had established footholds. Emergency vehicles raced through streets filled with civilians who had no idea where to find safety from enemies they had never expected to face. The Jedi Temple itself rose before them like a monument to everything his empire opposed. Its architecture spoke of permanence and spiritual transcendence, qualities that Sith philosophy dismissed as weaknesses that distracted from practical concerns about power and survival. Yet Malgus found himself reluctantly impressed by the structure's austere beauty. His assault team encountered their first serious resistance at the temple's main entrance, where a group of Jedi Knights had taken defensive positions behind hastily constructed barricades. These weren't the meditation-focused philosophers that Sith propaganda typically depicted. They were warriors whose lightsaber techniques had been honed through actual combat experience against Imperial forces. The battle that followed challenged every assumption Malgus had developed about Jedi capabilities. His opponents fought with coordination and tactical awareness that matched anything he had observed among Imperial special forces. More troubling still, they seemed to anticipate his moves with an accuracy that suggested genuine precognitive abilities rather than mere training exercises. But individual skill, however impressive, could not overcome the fundamental numerical disadvantage the Jedi faced. Malgus's assault team consisted of specially selected Sith warriors supported by the best Imperial commandos available. The defenders, despite their courage and competence, were simply overwhelmed by superior firepower and tactical coordination. As the last Jedi defender fell, Malgus found himself standing in the temple's main hall, surrounded by architectural marvels that represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom and artistic achievement. Holographic displays showed scenes from throughout galactic history, while ancient texts lined walls that had witnessed discussions between some of the greatest philosophical minds ever produced by any civilization. His communications officer's voice crackled through his helmet speaker system, reporting developments from throughout the assault zone. Lord Malgus, Imperial forces have secured the Senate building and government center. Republic leadership is requesting ceasefire negotiations. The words should have filled him with satisfaction. The impossible had been achieved. The Republic, cornerstone of galactic civilization for over 1,000 years, was surrendering to Imperial forces. Sith dreams that had seemed like fantasy during his youth were becoming reality. Yet as he stood in the conquered temple, Malgus experienced an emotional reaction that defied all logic. Tears were streaming down his face beneath his helmet, tears that had nothing to do with physical pain or fear of defeat. They were tears of loss, mourning for something precious that had been destroyed in the process of achieving victory. The realization that struck him in that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. Military conquest was easy compared to the challenge of building something worthy of the power required to achieve it. Destroying the Republic's ability to resist imperial expansion was a tactical objective that could be measured in terms of captured territory and surrendered fleets. But what would replace the civilization they had just defeated? His tactical training had prepared him to capture Coruscant, but nothing in his Sith education had equipped him to govern a galactic capital populated by beings who had never known imperial rule. The Dark Council's briefings had focused entirely on achieving victory without addressing the far more complex challenge of making that victory meaningful in terms of long-term imperial interests. As his forces completed their securing of the temple complex, Malgus walked through chambers where Jedi Masters had once debated questions of morality and justice that Sith philosophy dismissed as irrelevant weaknesses. But studying the inscriptions and artwork that decorated these spaces, he began to understand that dismissing ideas because they challenged Sith assumptions might be a form of intellectual weakness rather than strength. The Republic had endured for over a millennium, not because of military might or technological superiority, but because it had offered billions of beings something worth believing in. The promise of representation, the possibility of justice, the hope that different species could work together for mutual benefit rather than merely competing for dominance. Imperial victory had demonstrated Sith power, but it had also revealed the limitations of pure power as a foundation for sustainable governance. Fear could compel obedience, but it could not inspire the kind of voluntary cooperation that complex civilizations required to function effectively. Standing in the heart of the conquered temple, Malgus began to formulate ideas that would eventually lead him into direct conflict with the empire he had served so faithfully. What if imperial efficiency could be combined with Republic inclusiveness? What if Sith strength could be channeled toward building rather than merely conquering? These thoughts were interrupted by his communications officer's report that Republic officials were ready to begin formal surrender negotiations. The immediate military objectives had been achieved with unprecedented success. But as Malgus prepared to leave the temple and begin the next phase of imperial occupation, he understood that the most difficult challenges lay ahead. The young Sith Lord who had dreamed of reforming the Empire through military victory was beginning to realize that true reform would require something far more revolutionary than successful conquest. It would require reimagining the fundamental relationship between rulers and the ruled, between power and responsibility, between individual strength and collective achievement. But those realizations belonged to a future that seemed both inevitable and impossible. For now he had duties to fulfill, and a role to play in the political theater that would transform military victory into lasting imperial advantage. The Treaty of Coruscant was signed in what had once been the Republic Senate's most prestigious chamber, a vast rotunda where representatives from 1,000 worlds had gathered for centuries to debate the future of galactic civilization. Now that same space hosted negotiations between imperial diplomats and Republic officials who possessed no real bargaining power beyond the Empire's willingness to show restraint in victory. Malgus attended the ceremony as one of the conquering heroes, his presence serving both to intimidate Republic negotiators and to symbolize the military might that had made imperial victory possible. Chancellor Satale Shan, the Republic's chief negotiator, maintained her dignity despite circumstances that would have crushed lesser individuals. Her Jedi training had prepared her for many challenges, but nothing in that ancient tradition had equipped her to surrender half the galaxy to an enemy she had spent her life opposing. Yet she spoke each concession with clear determination, as if transforming necessary defeat into an act of conscious choice. The treaty terms themselves reflected both imperial ambition and Republic desperation. Entire star systems were transferred to imperial control with the stroke of a stylus. Trade routes that had enriched core world economies for millennia became imperial property. Most significantly, the Republic agreed to formal recognition of Sith legitimacy, ending centuries of ideological opposition to everything the Empire represented. But watching Republic officials sign away their civilization's heritage, Malgus began to understand that victory was creating as many problems as it solved. The Empire was inheriting responsibility for governing populations that had never known imperial rule and had no reason to welcome their new masters. Military conquest was temporary unless it could be transformed into sustainable political control. Between negotiating sessions, he found himself walking through Coruscant's lower levels, observing how imperial occupation was affecting ordinary citizens. The response was complex and troubling. Some beings welcomed imperial efficiency and order, particularly in districts where Republic bureaucracy had become corrupt or ineffective. Others retreated into sullen resentment that no amount of military force could address. Most disturbing were the children, too young to understand political complexities, but old enough to recognize that their world had fundamentally changed. They watched imperial troops with expressions that mixed curiosity and fear, trying to comprehend why beings in strange armor now controlled their neighborhoods. These young faces would grow up under imperial rule, but what kind of citizens would they become? Elena accompanied him on these informal surveys, her medical background providing insights into psychological responses that his military training had not prepared him to recognize. She observed details that escaped his attention, noting how different species were adapting to occupation in ways that reflected their cultural backgrounds and historical experiences. Her analysis highlighted challenges that the Dark Council's post-victory briefings had barely acknowledged. Imperial propaganda emphasized order and efficiency as universal benefits that all rational beings would eventually appreciate. But many of Coruscant's residents had historical reasons to distrust any government that concentrated power in the hands of a single species. The captured Jedi archives provided another source of uncomfortable insights, rather than the collection of mystical nonsense that Sith teachings had led him to expect. These records revealed sophisticated analyses of governance, diplomacy, and social organization that addressed precisely the challenges the Empire was now facing. One particularly significant document examined the decline of the Rakata Infinite Empire, analyzing how a technologically superior civilization had collapsed due to its inability to maintain the consent of subject populations. The parallels to imperial methodology were impossible to ignore. Raw power could achieve conquest, but sustainable rule required something more sophisticated than fear and intimidation. "Listen to this," Malgus said to Elena one evening as they reviewed captured Republic intelligence files. "A Jedi Master named Vrook Lamar wrote this analysis 3 centuries ago. Governments that rely primarily on force to maintain order inevitably face escalating resistance that eventually exceeds their capacity to suppress." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "That matches what I observed during my travels. The most stable Republic systems were those where local populations felt genuinely represented in galactic government. When beings believe their voices matter, they invest in making the system work. When they feel excluded or oppressed, they look for opportunities to undermine that system." Such conversations were becoming more frequent as the initial euphoria of victory gave way to the practical challenges of occupation. Malgus found himself questioning assumptions that had seemed obvious during his years of military service. The Empire's emphasis on species hierarchy and authoritarian control might actually be counterproductive from a strategic perspective. But these doubts remained private, shared only with Elena during their most intimate moments. Publicly, he maintained the role of loyal Imperial commander, participating in victory celebrations and propaganda events designed to demonstrate Sith supremacy to audiences throughout the galaxy. The parade route past the Jedi Temple, now flying Imperial banners where Republic symbols had hung for centuries. The sight should have filled him with satisfaction, but instead it generated a profound sense of loss. Something irreplaceable had been destroyed in the process of achieving victory, and no amount of military success could restore what had been sacrificed. That evening's reception brought together Imperial commanders and Republic officials in an atmosphere of forced civility that highlighted the artificial nature of their new relationship. Former enemies exchanged pleasantries while everyone pretended that fundamental hostilities had been resolved through military defeat rather than merely suppressed. Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan approached Malgus during the reception, offering congratulations on his tactical brilliance during the assault, but his words carried subtle implications that revealed how carefully Republic leaders were studying their new Imperial overlords. "Your reputation for strategic innovation preceded you, Lord Malgus," Organa observed. "The integration of diverse species within your command structure represents a significant departure from traditional Imperial methodology. I'm curious whether such innovations might influence broader Imperial policies regarding alien citizenship rights." The question was carefully phrased to sound like casual conversation, but Malgus recognized it as sophisticated political probing. Republic leaders were already looking for potential divisions within Imperial ranks, identifying commanders whose methods might indicate sympathy for Republic values. "The Empire utilizes whatever methods prove most effective for achieving our objectives," he replied diplomatically. "Species diversity within military units serves tactical purposes rather than reflecting any particular ideology." But even as he spoke the expected words, Malgus wondered whether Organa's observation contained more truth than he was willing to admit. His command methods had evolved in response to practical experience rather than political philosophy, but the results suggested that Imperial orthodoxy might be based on prejudice rather than strategic wisdom. Later that night, alone with Alina in their quarters overlooking the captured capital, he voiced concerns that would have been considered treasonous if overheard by Imperial intelligence agents. Alina moved to stand beside him at the viewport, her presence offering comfort that no military victory could provide. Change is possible, but it requires courage from beings who are willing to risk everything they've achieved for the possibility of something greater. For now, he was still the conquering hero, celebrated throughout Imperial space for achieving the impossible. But victory's hollow taste was teaching him that destroying enemies was far easier than building the kind of civilization that deserved to inherit their legacy. The months following the Treaty of Coruscant transformed Malgus from a military commander into something unprecedented in Imperial history. A Sith Lord who spent his days governing conquered territory while his nights were devoted to writing philosophical treatises that challenged the fundamental assumptions of the civilization he served. His administrative responsibilities required him to address practical problems that the Academy had never prepared him to handle. How do you maintain order among billions of beings who view your government as an occupying force? How do you transform military conquest into legitimate authority? How do you build an economy that serves Imperial interests while providing conquered populations with reasons to support rather than resist their new government? These questions led him into areas of study that previous Sith Lords had dismissed as beneath their attention. He read extensively about governmental theory, economic policy, and social organization, seeking insights that might help him understand why some civilizations thrived while others collapsed despite superior military strength. The captured Republic archives became his private university, offering perspectives on leadership and governance that Sith education had never addressed. He discovered analyses of successful administrative transitions, studies of cultural integration techniques, and examinations of how diverse populations could be unified around shared objectives rather than merely controlled through fear. Most significantly, he began drafting his own contributions to political philosophy, documents that would eventually be circulated throughout Imperial space despite their controversial implications. His first major work, titled Strength Through Unity, argued that the Empire's emphasis on individual dominance actually weakened the state by preventing effective cooperation between different groups and species. The rule of two serves the Sith Order by ensuring that power passes to the strongest individual, he wrote in one particularly provocative passage. But governing a galactic empire requires coordination between thousands of officials, millions of soldiers, and billions of citizens. Individual strength means nothing if it cannot be effectively organized and directed toward achievable objectives. Such ideas represented heresy, according to traditional Sith doctrine, which held that superior individuals naturally commanded the obedience of their inferiors. But Malgus's experience governing Coruscant had demonstrated that voluntary cooperation produced far better results than compelled submission. His administrative staff reflected this philosophical evolution. Rather than appointing only humans to positions of authority, he selected officials based on competence and expertise regardless of their species background. A Bothan intelligence analyst became his chief advisor on Republic political networks. A Chiss economist designed trade policies that revitalized sectors of the Coruscant economy that had been disrupted by the transition to imperial rule. The results were immediate and impressive. Districts under his administration experienced less civil unrest than other occupied territories. Economic productivity recovered more quickly. Most importantly, intelligence reports indicated that active resistance movements were weaker in his jurisdictions than in areas governed by more traditional imperial methods. But these successes generated suspicion among imperial purists who viewed his innovations as dangerous precedents that undermined the ideological foundations of Sith rule. Darth Malgus, already suspicious of Malgus's unconventional military methods, began conducting formal investigations into his administrative practices. Reports suggest that you are consulting with alien advisors on matters of imperial policy, Malgus announced during a tense meeting in his fortress on Documentaries. Such consultations imply that their opinions carry weight in your decision-making process. Their insights help me understand local conditions that affect the success of imperial policies, Malgus replied carefully. Knowledge of how different populations respond to various administrative approaches serves imperial interests by improving the effectiveness of our governance. The exchange highlighted a fundamental divide within imperial leadership about the purpose of government itself. Traditional Sith viewed governance primarily as a means of demonstrating and maintaining their superiority over other species. Malgus was developing a perspective that saw governance as a tool for achieving broader imperial objectives that required the cooperation of diverse populations. The movement gained momentum when several prominent imperial economists published analyses supporting Malgus's arguments about the relationship between administrative efficiency and economic prosperity. Their research demonstrated that systems incorporating diverse perspectives achieved better outcomes than those relying exclusively on single-species leadership. But intellectual support from fellow reformers also attracted attention from imperial intelligence, which began monitoring his activities with increasing concern. Agent reports suggested that his influence was spreading beyond military and administrative circles into areas that could potentially threaten the stability of imperial political structure. The situation reached a crisis point when the Dark Council summoned him to explain why his governed territories were developing what they termed dangerous democratic tendencies. The formal hearing took place in the council chambers, where 12 of the most powerful Sith in the galaxy sat in judgment of his innovations. Darth Malgus served as the primary interrogator, his ancient features twisted into expressions of barely contained fury. Your administrative methods have created expectations among alien populations that their opinions matter in imperial decision-making. Such expectations constitute a direct challenge to the principle of Sith supremacy that justifies our authority. My methods have produced superior results in terms of economic recovery, civil order, and administrative efficiency, Malgus replied, presenting detailed statistical analyses that supported his claims. Results are not the only measure of policy success, interjected Darth Ravage. Methods that achieve short-term gains while undermining long-term imperial legitimacy constitute strategic failures regardless of their immediate benefits. The debate continued for hours, with council members raising objections that revealed the depth of their commitment to maintaining existing power structures regardless of practical consequences. They were not interested in administrative effectiveness or economic prosperity. They were concerned about preserving a system that guaranteed their continued dominance over populations they viewed as inherently inferior. Malgus left the hearing with a formal reprimand and explicit orders to modify his administrative methods to conform more closely with established imperial doctrine. But the experience had clarified something that had been developing in his mind for months. The current imperial leadership was incapable of the kind of systematic reform that galactic governance required. That realization led him to begin planning something that would have been unthinkable during his earlier career. If the Dark Council could not or would not adapt imperial methods to meet the challenges of governing a diverse galactic population, then perhaps new leadership was necessary. The philosophical foundation for his eventual rebellion was laid during this period, though he did not yet recognize the full implications of his evolving worldview. He was still thinking in terms of reforming the empire rather than replacing its leadership. But his writings and administrative innovations were creating a framework for governmental change that would eventually require him to choose between loyalty to the existing system and commitment to his vision of what that system could become. Elena served as both inspiration and sounding board during this intellectual evolution. Her perspectives on justice, equality, and the proper relationship between authority and responsibility helped him articulate ideas that might otherwise have remained intuitive rather than systematic. "You're not just questioning imperial methods," she observed during one of their lengthy discussions. "You're developing an entirely different conception of what government should accomplish. The Empire views conquest as an end in itself, but you're beginning to see it as a means toward creating something better than either the Republic or the current imperial system has achieved." Her insight was accurate in ways that would soon become apparent to everyone in the galaxy. The warrior who had conquered Coruscant was transforming into a visionary whose ultimate goals extended far beyond military victory. But achieving that vision would require sacrifices that he could not yet imagine, including the sacrifice of everything he had come to value most. The philosopher-warrior was about to discover that some prices are too high to pay even for dreams that could reshape the destiny of galactic civilization itself. The trap was set with the meticulous precision that only decades of Sith political maneuvering could achieve. Darth Angral had spent months studying Malgus's behavioral patterns, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited without direct confrontation. The Dark Council member understood that destroying a popular military hero required subtlety rather than brute force. Elena represented the perfect pressure point, a weakness disguised as strength that could be used to neutralize Malgus's growing influence within imperial circles. But Angral's scheme required more than simply threatening her safety. The opportunity arose when Imperial intelligence intercepted communications, suggesting that Republic operatives were planning to rescue prominent prisoners being held in Imperial custody. Among the potential targets was Elena Daru, whose status as Malgus's advisor had made her a symbol of Imperial collaboration for resistance movements throughout occupied territory. Angral presented this intelligence to the Dark Council as evidence that Malgus's unorthodox relationships were compromising Imperial security. His emotional attachment to this alien female has created operational vulnerabilities that our enemies are actively exploiting, he argued, during a closed session that Malgus was not permitted to attend. The revelation came during what should have been a routine intelligence briefing in Malgus's administrative offices on Coruscant. His chief intelligence analyst, the Bothan he had promoted despite species prejudices, presented evidence of the planned operation with obvious reluctance. "The Republic team is scheduled to extract multiple targets tomorrow evening," she reported, her voice carefully neutral. "Master Daru appears to be their primary objective. but they've also identified several other high-value prisoners whose intelligence could compromise ongoing Imperial operations. Malgus studied the tactical projections with growing understanding of the impossible position he had been placed in. Allowing the rescue to succeed would validate every criticism his enemies had made about the security risks of his reform policies. But preventing it would require him to treat Alina as just another prisoner rather than the woman he loved. "What are the recommended countermeasures?" he asked, though he already knew what his intelligence staff would propose. "Standard protocol calls for transferring all targeted prisoners to maximum security facilities where rescue operations would be impossible," his analyst replied. "However, such transfers would likely alert Republic operatives to our knowledge of their plans, possibly compromising our intelligence sources. The alternative was equally unpalatable. Or we could allow the operation to proceed while monitoring it for intelligence purposes, accepting the loss of the prisoners in exchange for information about Republic operational capabilities." Neither option addressed the real choice he was facing. Malgus understood that this was not actually about prisoner security or intelligence gathering. It was about whether he was willing to sacrifice everything he had achieved for the sake of personal loyalty to someone who represented everything his enemies opposed. That evening, he walked alone through the captured Jedi Temple, seeking clarity among the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of difficult decisions. The facility had been converted into an Imperial administrative center, but traces of its original purpose remained visible in architectural details that spoke of meditation and contemplation. He found Alina in the chamber that had once served as the temple's main library, where she spent her evenings studying Republic historical texts that hadn't been destroyed during the occupation. She looked up from a manuscript about social reform movements, her expression showing immediate concern at his obvious distress. "What's happened?" she asked, rising to meet him with the kind of intuitive understanding that had characterized their relationship from its beginning. Rather than attempting to shield her from the reality of their situation, Malgus explained the full scope of Angrel's trap. She listened without interruption, her face reflecting comprehension of both the immediate danger and its broader implications for everything they had built together. "So you have to choose between saving me and preserving your ability to implement the reforms that could change the Empire," she said when he finished. "It's an elegant trap, really. Either choice destroys what we've been working toward." "There might be another way," he began, but she silenced him with a gesture. "No, there isn't, and we both know it." She moved closer, taking his hands in hers with the gentle strength that had first attracted him to her. "Your vision of what this empire could become is more important than either of our individual lives. Some possibilities are worth any sacrifice." The conversation that followed would haunt him for the remainder of his existence. They spoke of dreams that would never be realized, of the children they would never have, of a future where beings like them could love across species lines without political consequences. "I need you to understand something," Alina said, as dawn approached over Coruscant's endless cityscape. "Everything I've seen you accomplish, every life you've improved through your policies, every precedent you've established for inclusive governance, that's your real legacy. Not military victories or political power, but the proof that different kinds of beings can work together for mutual benefit." Her words revealed the depth of her understanding about what his reforms actually meant. She had recognized from the beginning that his innovations represented more than administrative efficiency. They were demonstrations that the galaxy's future didn't have to be determined by the prejudices and limitations of its past. The final day passed with surreal normalcy. They attended administrative meetings, reviewed policy proposals, and maintained the facade of ordinary governmental routine, while both knowing it would be their last day together. Alina seemed determined to spend their remaining hours focusing on the work that had brought them together rather than the personal loss that separation would entail. That evening, As Republic operatives moved into position around the facility where she was supposedly imprisoned, Malgus made the choice that would define the rest of his life. Rather than allowing her to be rescued and used against him, rather than permitting his enemies to destroy everything he had built, he entered her chambers one final time. She was waiting for him, having known since morning what his decision would be. "You understand that this is the only way to protect what we've created together," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I understand," he replied, igniting his lightsaber with hands that trembled for the first time since his youth. "But understanding doesn't make it bearable." The act itself was swift and merciful, but its emotional impact shattered something fundamental within his soul. The woman who had taught him that strength could be expressed through compassion, that power could be used to build rather than merely dominate, that love could exist between beings regardless of species or political allegiance, was gone by his own hand. When Imperial forces discovered her body the following morning, Angrel's agents were quick to spread the official explanation. Elena Daru had been eliminated as a security risk, demonstrating Lord Malgus's absolute loyalty to Imperial interests over personal attachments. The Republic rescue operation had been thwarted, proving the effectiveness of traditional security measures. But those who knew Malgus recognized that something irreplaceable had died with her. The passionate advocate for reform became a cold, distant figure who pursued his political objectives with mechanical efficiency rather than the inspiring vision that had previously characterized his leadership. The price of protecting his ability to change the Empire had been the destruction of everything that made that change worthwhile. He had saved his position by sacrificing his soul, preserved his influence by destroying his capacity for the kind of love that had made his vision of a better future seem possible. The philosopher-warrior had learned the ultimate lesson about the cost of power. Some prices are indeed too high to pay, but once you have paid them, the only way to honor that sacrifice is to ensure that it serves a purpose worthy of what it cost. Darth Malgus would spend the remainder of his life attempting to build an empire that would justify the death of the only person who had ever truly understood what he was trying to achieve. But he would do so without the compassion and humanity that had originally made his vision worth pursuing. The transformation of Darth Malgus from Imperial loyalist to revolutionary began in the months following Elena's death, though the galaxy would not recognize the change until it was far too late to prevent. On the surface, he continued performing his duties as a conquering hero, attending ceremonies and issuing proclamations that reinforced Imperial authority throughout occupied territory. But beneath this facade of compliance, he was constructing something unprecedented in Sith history. His first step was consolidating a power base independent of the Dark Council's direct control. Using his authority as administrator of conquered territories, he began transferring loyal officers to key positions throughout Imperial space. These weren't traditional Sith appointments based on species hierarchy or political connections. They were beings who had proven their competence under his command and shared his vision of effective governance. The network he assembled reflected the diversity that had made his military units so successful. Chiss tactical analysts took charge of strategic planning divisions. Twislic intelligence operatives infiltrated Republic resistance movements. Human officers who had distinguished themselves through merit rather than birthright found themselves commanding fleets and star systems. But Malgus's most revolutionary innovation was the recruitment of former Republic officials who had demonstrated administrative competence during the transition to Imperial rule. Rather than dismissing these individuals as defeated enemies, he offered them positions within his growing organization based on their expertise and proven results. Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan became an unlikely ally, after recognizing that Malgus represented the best hope for protecting his people under Imperial rule. Their private meetings, conducted in absolute secrecy, focused on developing governmental structures that could satisfy imperial security requirements while preserving some measure of local autonomy. You're offering something that neither the Republic nor the traditional empire has ever achieved, Organa observed during one particularly significant conversation. A system that combines effective central authority with genuine respect for diverse populations. I'm offering the only alternative to endless cycles of conquest and rebellion, Malgus replied. Both the Republic and the current imperial system are fundamentally unsustainable because they fail to address the legitimate needs of the populations they claim to serve. These discussions laid the groundwork for what would eventually become his declaration of independence from the Dark Council, but first, he needed to demonstrate that his alternative vision could achieve results that justified the enormous risks of open rebellion. The opportunity came when the Council assigned him to suppress a major uprising in the Outer Rim territories, where Republic loyalists had established a shadow government that was coordinating resistance activities across multiple star systems. Traditional Imperial response would have involved massive military force designed to crush the rebellion through overwhelming violence. Instead, Malgus implemented a strategy that combined targeted military action with political outreach to populations that had legitimate grievances against Imperial rule. Rather than treating all rebels as equally dangerous enemies, he distinguished between hardcore resistance fighters and ordinary citizens who had been driven to rebellion by Imperial policies that ignored their basic needs. Within 6 months, systems that had been centers of active rebellion became models of productive cooperation between Imperial authority and local populations. Economic indicators improved dramatically as resources previously devoted to internal security were redirected toward infrastructure development and trade expansion. But perhaps most significantly, intelligence reports from these reformed territories indicated that popular support for continued resistance had virtually disappeared. Citizens who had previously viewed Imperial rule as an occupation force began seeing it as a legitimate government that addressed their concerns and protected their interests. These successes attracted attention throughout the galaxy, including regions still under Republic control. Populations that had resisted Imperial expansion began questioning whether their assumptions about Sith governance were accurate. If Imperial rule could provide effective administration while respecting local autonomy, perhaps the choice between freedom and order was a false dilemma. The Dark Council's response to these developments revealed the depth of their commitment to maintaining traditional power structures, regardless of practical consequences. Rather than celebrating Malgus's innovations as proof of Imperial superiority, they viewed his methods as dangerous precedents that threatened the ideological foundations of Sith authority. Darth Mortis summoned him to Drummond Kais for what was ostensibly a routine briefing on Outer Rim operations. But the meeting that followed made clear that the Council viewed his reforms as a greater threat than Republic resistance had ever represented. Your methods in the Outer Rim have produced impressive short-term results, Mortis acknowledged with obvious reluctance. However, they have also created expectations among alien populations that their opinions matter in Imperial decision-making. Such expectations constitute a fundamental challenge to Sith supremacy. My methods have eliminated active rebellion while increasing economic productivity and reducing administrative costs, Malgus replied, presenting detailed analyses that supported his claims. These outcomes serve Imperial interests more effectively than traditional approaches that generate constant resistance. Imperial interests are not defined solely by economic efficiency or administrative convenience. Mortis responded coldly. The Empire exists to demonstrate and maintain Sith superiority over inferior species. Policies that suggest equality rather than dominance undermine the psychological foundations of our authority. The conversation continued for hours, but its essential point became clear within the first few minutes. The Dark Council was not interested in governmental effectiveness or long-term stability. They were committed to preserving a system that guaranteed their continued dominance, regardless of its impact on Imperial strategic objectives. That realization forced Malgus to confront a choice he had been avoiding since Alina's death. He could continue working within the existing system, accepting its limitations and compromising his vision to maintain his position. Or he could pursue his reforms to their logical conclusion, even if that meant direct confrontation with the Empire's established leadership. Malgus spent his final weeks as an Imperial loyalist preparing for what he knew would be the most challenging campaign of his career. But this time, his enemy would not be Republic forces or alien rebels. His enemy would be the very system that had created him. His declaration of independence was delivered simultaneously to Imperial and Republic leadership, transmitted across the galaxy by communications networks that his supporters had spent months infiltrating. The message was both a manifesto and a challenge, outlining his vision for galactic governance while formally rejecting the authority of the Dark Council. "I am Darth Malgus, and I reject the false choice between Republic weakness and Imperial tyranny," his statement began. "Both systems have failed because they prioritize ideology over results, political convenience over genuine solutions to the challenges facing galactic civilization." The declaration continued with specific proposals for governmental reform that incorporated elements from both Republic and Imperial traditions, while addressing the weaknesses that had made both systems vulnerable to internal collapse. It was a document that historians would study for centuries as either the blueprint for a better future or the delusional fantasy of a brilliant but misguided idealist. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Entire star systems declared their allegiance to his cause within days of his announcement. Republic populations that had resisted Imperial expansion welcomed his forces as liberators rather than conquerors. Even within traditional Imperial territory, military units and administrative districts began openly supporting his rebellion. For the first time in galactic history, a single individual had managed to build a coalition that transcended the traditional boundaries between Republic and Imperial space. Beings who had been enemies for generations found common ground in supporting a leader who offered something neither of their governments had ever provided. But Malgus understood that declaring independence was far easier than maintaining it. Both the Republic and the Empire viewed his movement as an existential threat that had to be destroyed regardless of the cost. He was now fighting a war against opponents who commanded vastly superior resources and had nothing to lose from his success. The false emperor, as his enemies began calling him, had chosen a path that would require him to prove that his vision was not just theoretically superior, but practically achievable under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The war that followed Malgus's declaration lasted 3 brutal years, a conflict that redefined the meaning of galactic warfare by forcing traditional enemies to confront threats that transcended their historical animosities. For the first time since the ancient Sith Wars, Republic and Imperial forces found themselves fighting alongside each other against a common enemy who represented everything both governments feared most. Malgus's coalition proved remarkably resilient despite facing overwhelming odds. His diverse command structure adapted to changing battlefield conditions with flexibility that neither purely Republic nor purely Imperial forces could match. When traditional tactics failed, his commanders improvised solutions that drew upon multiple military traditions and cultural perspectives. The CIS officers he had promoted brought strategic patience that allowed his forces to avoid decisive battles until conditions favored their success. Twi'lek intelligence operatives provided information networks that penetrated both Republic and Imperial security systems. Former Republic naval commanders contributed tactical innovations that had never been tested against Imperial opponents. But perhaps most importantly, his civilian administrators demonstrated that effective governance was possible even during wartime. territories under his control experienced less disruption than regions where Republic and Imperial forces were fighting purely military campaigns. His policies continued to address local needs while maintaining the industrial capacity necessary to support his war effort. These achievements attracted growing support from populations that had initially remained neutral in the conflict. Star systems that had expected to wait out another pointless war between traditional enemies found themselves actively supporting a movement that offered genuine alternatives to governmental structures they had never trusted. The turning point came during the Siege of Ilum, where Malgus had established his primary military headquarters in facilities that had once served Jedi pilgrims seeking crystals for their lightsabers. The symbolism was deliberately chosen to represent his vision of transcending traditional conflicts between light and dark, Republic and Empire, individual species and galactic civilization. Republic and Imperial forces coordinated their assault with precision that reflected months of joint planning between governments that had been mortal enemies just years earlier. Their combined fleet represented the largest concentration of military power assembled since the Great Hyperspace War, designed to eliminate Malgus's rebellion through overwhelming force. The battle for Ilum lasted 6 months, with fighting that demonstrated both the tactical brilliance and ultimate futility of Malgus's position. His forces inflicted casualties that shocked both Republic and Imperial high commands, proving that diverse coalitions could achieve military effectiveness that exceeded the sum of their individual capabilities. Yet numerical superiority eventually overcame tactical innovation. For every enemy ship his forces destroyed, 10 more appeared to take its place. For every victory his ground forces achieved, enemy reinforcements arrived to reverse their gains. The mathematics of attrition warfare made his defeat inevitable, regardless of his strategic genius. During the final phase of the siege, as enemy forces closed around his command center, Malgus found himself contemplating the meaning of failure in ways that his Sith training had never prepared him to consider. Traditional Sith philosophy viewed defeat as proof of personal weakness, a judgment that the defeated had lacked sufficient strength to achieve their objectives. But his experience had taught him that some failures revealed strengths that success could never demonstrate. His rebellion had proven that beings from different species and cultural backgrounds could unite around shared principles rather than merely submitting to superior force. That proof would survive his military defeat and continue influencing future generations, regardless of what happened to him personally. His final conversations with surviving staff members focused not on tactical options for escape or negotiation, but on ensuring that the ideas behind his movement would outlive its military expression. "We have demonstrated that the choice between freedom and order is indeed false," he wrote in what would become his final political testament. Effective government requires both individual liberty and collective responsibility, both respect for diversity and commitment to shared objectives. Future leaders who understand this principle will achieve what we could not. The document was transmitted to supporters throughout the galaxy before Republic and Imperial forces breached his final defensive perimeter. Its recipients included not just military commanders and political leaders, but scholars, philosophers, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by his vision of what galactic civilization could become. The assault on his command center was led personally by a joint Republic-Imperial strike team that included some of the most skilled warriors from both traditions. These weren't ordinary soldiers seeking battlefield glory, but elite operatives who understood they were participating in a historically significant event. Malgus faced his attackers in the crystalline chambers beneath Ilum's surface, where Jedi had once meditated on the nature of the Force and their responsibilities to galactic civilization. The irony was not lost on him that he would make his final stand in a place dedicated to philosophical contemplation rather than military conquest. The battle that followed demonstrated why he had become legendary throughout Imperial and Republic space. Even facing overwhelming odds, even knowing that defeat was inevitable, he fought with skill and determination that forced his enemies to acknowledge his exceptional abilities. But individual prowess, however impressive, could not overcome the fundamental reality of his situation. When Republic Colonel Jace Malcolm delivered the killing blow, Malgus felt something unexpected, not the bitter rage that Sith tradition promised in moments of defeat, but a strange sense of completion. He had pursued his vision as far as individual effort could take it. Whether that vision would ultimately succeed would depend on choices made by future generations who might learn from his example. His final words, recorded by Republic intelligence agents who witnessed his death, reflected the philosophical evolution that had transformed him from a traditional Sith Lord into something unprecedented in galactic history. The empire I envisioned will rise from the ashes of both our civilizations, not today, not tomorrow, but someday when beings are ready to choose cooperation over domination. The immediate aftermath of his death seemed to confirm that his rebellion had achieved nothing beyond causing massive destruction throughout the galaxy. Republic and Imperial forces quickly dismantled the governmental structures he had established, returning occupied territories to their previous administrations. But the ideas he had championed proved more resilient than the military force that had protected them. Throughout both Republic and Imperial space, administrators began quietly implementing policies that reflected his insights about effective governance. Species integration increased in both military and civilian organizations. Local autonomy expanded in regions where central authority had previously micromanaged every decision. Most significantly, a generation of young leaders emerged who had witnessed firsthand that alternatives to traditional governmental structures were possible. The Republic strike team that had eliminated him returned to Coruscant as heroes, celebrated for ending a threat that had challenged the fundamental assumptions of galactic order. Colonel Malcolm himself became an advocate for Republic military reforms that incorporated tactical innovations developed by Malgus's diverse command structure. His influence helped establish training programs that prepared Republic forces to work effectively with alien allies rather than merely commanding their obedience. The false emperor was dead, but his legacy had already begun spreading through channels that neither Republic nor Imperial intelligence services could monitor or control. Ideas once released into galactic consciousness follow patterns of development that transcend the political circumstances of their origin. In death, Darth Malgus achieved something that had eluded him in life. He became a symbol of possibility rather than a specific political program, an inspiration for future reformers rather than a leader whose personal limitations could undermine his message. The hero's end was also a beginning, though none of the beings who witnessed his defeat could have anticipated the transformation his death would ultimately catalyze throughout galactic civilization. History, as they say, is written by the victors. But sometimes the defeated leave echoes that resonate far beyond their temporary silencing ripples that spread through time and space in ways their enemies never anticipated. The official records of both the Republic and the Empire dismissed Darth Malgus as a brilliant but misguided traitor whose rebellion had ultimately failed to achieve any lasting change. Yet in the decades following his death, subtle transformations began appearing throughout galactic civilization that bore unmistakable traces of his influence. These changes emerged not through dramatic political upheavals or military campaigns, but through the quiet decisions of individuals who had been touched by his vision of what government could accomplish when it served all its citizens rather than merely its ruling class. Within the Imperial military, his tactical innovations became standard doctrine, despite official disapproval of his political activities. The integration of diverse species into command positions, initially dismissed as dangerous experimentation, proved so effective that even traditional Sith Lords began quietly adopting his methods. Young Imperial officers studied his campaigns not for their political implications, but for the practical lessons they offered about leadership and strategic planning. The Sith Academy, on Dromund Cassi, added his writings to their restricted archives, officially classifying them as examples of heretical thinking that students should understand in order to recognize and resist similar ideas. But many of those students emerged from their studies with expanded perspectives on what Sith strength could accomplish beyond mere personal dominance. One particularly influential graduate was a young Sith Lord named Darth Revan, who built upon Malgus's philosophical foundations to develop his own synthesis of light and dark side teachings. Though Revan's eventual path would lead him far from Imperial service, his early career reflected insights about the relationship between individual power and collective responsibility that clearly derived from studying Malgus's example. In Republic space, the changes were equally significant, if less obvious. The governmental reforms that Malgus had implemented during his brief occupation of Coruscant had demonstrated possibilities that many Republic leaders had never seriously considered. Species that had been marginalized within the traditional power structure began demanding greater representation based on proven examples of their capabilities. The Galactic Senate gradually evolved toward more inclusive procedures that gave smaller systems genuine influence over decisions that affected their populations. These changes weren't implemented all at once or attributed to any single source, but careful analysis revealed patterns that matched principles Malgus had articulated in his political writings. Perhaps most significantly, a new generation of Jedi emerged who had been deeply influenced by witnessing the complexity of his character. These young knights struggled with questions that previous generations had dismissed as irrelevant to their spiritual development. Could someone who committed terrible acts in service of noble goals be considered entirely evil? Could the dark side be channeled toward constructive purposes under certain circumstances? Master Satele Shan, who had negotiated the Treaty of Coruscant and later observed Malgus's rebellion firsthand, became an advocate for expanded Jedi involvement in governmental affairs. Her argument was subtle but revolutionary in its implications. If Force users could perceive truths that ordinary beings missed, perhaps they had responsibilities beyond personal enlightenment. The Jedi Council initially resisted such ideas, viewing them as dangerous departures from traditional teachings about non-attachment and political neutrality. But the practical challenges of governing a galaxy torn by centuries of warfare gradually forced them to acknowledge that pure contemplation might be insufficient response to genuine suffering. Economic systems throughout both Republic and Imperial space began adopting administrative techniques that Malgus had pioneered during his brief experiments with inclusive governance. The integration of diverse perspectives into decision-making processes, initially dismissed as inefficient idealism, proved to generate more accurate assessments of local conditions and more effective policy responses. Trade relationships developed between systems that had previously been separated by political boundaries, creating economic incentives for cooperation that transcended traditional military alliances. Merchants and manufacturers discovered that diversity of suppliers and markets provided greater stability than exclusive relationships with single political entities. Cultural exchanges accelerated as populations that had been isolated by governmental policies began sharing artistic traditions, educational methods, and technological innovations. Universities throughout the galaxy established scholarship programs that enabled students from different species and political systems to study together, creating networks of personal relationships that survived political changes. The most profound long-term impact appeared in the realm of ideas about citizenship and political legitimacy. Malgus had demonstrated that effective government required the voluntary cooperation of the governed rather than merely their reluctant obedience. This insight gradually influenced expectations about what populations could demand from their leaders and what leaders owed to their subjects. Resistance movements throughout the galaxy began adopting organizational techniques that Malgus had developed, combining military effectiveness with political outreach in ways that made them far more difficult for established governments to suppress. But many of these movements also embraced his emphasis on constructive alternatives rather than purely destructive opposition. The result was a gradual shift toward more responsive governmental institutions that addressed genuine grievances before they could escalate into violent rebellion. Both Republic and Imperial administrators found themselves compelled to consider the long-term consequences of their policies rather than focusing exclusively on immediate political advantages. Legal systems evolved toward greater emphasis on restorative rather than purely punitive justice, reflecting Malgus's insight that sustainable order required addressing the underlying causes of conflict rather than merely suppressing its symptoms. Courts began considering social and economic factors when determining appropriate responses to criminal behavior. Educational institutions throughout the galaxy gradually incorporated his writings into their curricula, initially as historical documents that illustrated the dangers of political extremism. But students who studied his actual arguments rather than simplified summaries often emerged with more nuanced understanding of governmental challenges and possibilities. The irony was not lost on careful observers that someone branded as the ultimate traitor by both traditional governments had inspired reforms that strengthened rather than weakened the foundations of galactic civilization. His rebellion had failed in military terms, but his ideas had succeeded in ways that no purely military victory could have achieved. 50 years after his death, a secret conference was held on a neutral world where representatives from throughout the galaxy gathered to discuss the long-term implications of what historians were beginning to call the Malgus effect. The participants included Republic senators, Imperial administrators, Jedi masters, Sith Lords, independent system leaders, and scholars from dozens of species. Their private discussions revealed the extent to which his vision had influenced developments that official histories attributed to other causes. The gradual reduction in interspecies conflict, the increased effectiveness of governmental institutions, the growing economic cooperation between previously hostile systems, all bore traces of principles he had articulated during his brief experiment with inclusive governance. But perhaps most significantly, the conference participants agreed that the galaxy was approaching a threshold where the false choice between Republic weakness and Imperial tyranny might finally be transcended. New forms of political organization were emerging that combined effective central authority with genuine respect for local autonomy and individual rights. The man they had branded as a traitor was being quietly recognized as a visionary whose understanding of governmental challenges had been decades ahead of his time. His personal failures and tragic choices were not forgotten, but they were increasingly viewed as the inevitable cost of pioneering ideas that his generation had not been ready to implement. As the conference concluded, and its participants returned to their respective systems, many carried with them a shared recognition that Darth Malgus's greatest victory had not been achieved through military conquest or political maneuvering. It had been won through the power of ideas to survive the destruction of those who first articulated them. The legacy of the betrayer was becoming the foundation for a future that neither Republic nor Empire could have achieved alone. A galaxy where diversity was recognized as strength rather than weakness, where cooperation was valued more than domination, where the needs of all citizens mattered regardless of their species or birthplace. The whisper that had begun in the mind of a young Sith Lord on Drummond Kaz had become a chorus that echoed across the stars, growing stronger with each passing generation. In the quiet spaces between stars, where ancient light travels distances so vast that civilizations rise and fall before it reaches its destination, there exists a kind of peace that transcends the temporary struggles of mortal beings. It is here, in these cosmic silences, that the true measure of any life becomes clear, stripped of political rhetoric and historical interpretation, reduced to the simple question of whether existence was made better or worse by one person's choices. The tomb of Darth Malgus rests on a forgotten world in the Outer Rim, unmarked by monuments or official recognition from any government. Yet pilgrims come, drawn by stories passed down through generations of beings who remember that once, briefly, someone had offered them hope for something better than endless cycles of conquest and submission. They come from species that had never heard his name during his lifetime, carrying flowers that bloom in colors he never saw, speaking languages that evolved long after his voice was silenced. But they come nonetheless, because the human heart recognizes courage when it encounters it, even across centuries and light years, and the barriers that separate different forms of life. The epitaph, carved in simple basic script, reads, "Only he tried." No titles, no lists of victories, no political manifestos, just those two words that somehow capture everything important about a life that reached for transformation and fell short of perfection but never stopped reaching. Above his resting place, Drummond Cass continues its eternal storm, lightning still splitting skies that have known no peace for millennia. The Sith Academy still trains young minds in the ancient ways of power and domination, though now the curriculum includes cautionary tales about the dangers of caring too much about the weak. But in the Academy's deepest archives, scholars discover documents that suggest a different interpretation of strength, writings that propose revolutionary ideas about what it might mean to be truly powerful in a galaxy where billions of beings must somehow find ways to live together. On Coruscant, the rebuilt Jedi Temple stands as testament to resilience and renewal, its spires reaching towards stars that have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. In its meditation chambers, young Jedi contemplate questions that their predecessors might have dismissed as too worldly for spiritual consideration. Can compassion exist alongside necessary action? Can love survive the choices that leadership sometimes demands? Can the light side of the Force be reconciled with the understanding that some darkness may be required to protect what we cherish most? These are the questions that Malgus faced and could never fully answer. The paradoxes that drove him to attempt something that no one before or since has managed to achieve. The perfect synthesis of strength and mercy, authority and freedom, individual will and collective responsibility. Perhaps such perfection is impossible in a universe where choice always carries consequence, where every decision closes certain doors while opening others. Perhaps the tragedy of consciousness is that we can envision ideals we lack the wisdom or power to implement. In cantinas throughout the galaxy, where beings gather to share stories and dreams over drinks that blur the edges of reality, old spaces sometimes tell tales of the Sith Lord who wept for his enemies, who loved a woman more than power, who died trying to build something worthy of the sacrifice it cost. The details change with each telling, as stories do, but the essential truth remains constant. Once, someone believed that the galaxy could be better than it was, and that belief was strong enough to shake the foundations of empires. The stars continue their ancient dance, indifferent to the hopes and fears of creatures whose lives span mere decades against their cosmic eternities. But in the brief flicker of mortal existence, in the choices made by beings who know they will not live to see the full consequences of their actions, something magnificent sometimes emerges. The name Darth Malgus has become legend, symbol, cautionary tale, and inspiration depending on who speaks it and why. But beyond the politics and the history and the endless scholarly debates about his methods and motivations, something simpler and more profound endures. The possibility that love can exist in the darkest places, that strength can serve justice rather than merely advancing itself, that even the most flawed among us might leave the galaxy slightly better than we found it. In the vast tapestry of existence, where countless other stories await discovery and telling, this truth echoes on, not as promise or prophecy, but as invitation to each new generation that must choose, again and again, between the easy path of accepting things as they are, and the harder road of imagining what they might become. The whisper that began in darkness has become a song that even silence cannot contain.